Hi all. This week and next week we're talking about the communication skills that you need to successfully manage conflict through either negotiation or mediation. So the key to all of this is thinking about the difference between distributive and integrative approaches to conflict. Now, I started to talk about this in the video last week when we discussed conflict styles. Something like collaboration is a more integrative style, where compromise or sort of win-lose approaches think about conflict as something where things have to be distributed. The winning has to be distributed. So these are also larger strategies people use when engaging in formal processes like negotiation and mediation. Books like Getting to Yes and resources from the Harvard Negotiation Project teach people how to use an integrative approach to negotiating. And the key idea, as we said last week, is to somehow unearth people's deeper interests and core values related to the issue, rather than focusing on the surface level, on the sort of stated positions or the ask that they have. Once those interests or values are articulated, then you can work toward a solution that integrates them and is more acceptable or even seen as beneficial to all parties involved. That's when we are able to focus on collaboration rather than compromise. So that all sounds lovely, but how? How do we make this happen? So two key communication skills that I'm going to talk about today are active listening and asking the right kinds of questions. So let's start by talking about listening. I know it sounds obvious or kind of trite or even superficial or kind of naive to say something like, if we just listen to each other, then we can solve our problems and conflict. Of course, that's oversimplified. But active listening is still very important. It can help build relationships, promote collaboration, and move toward integrative conflict resolution, but it's really hard work. And listening is a very complex process. So sometimes people think about listening just as like, oh, I just sit here quietly and let somebody talk, as though we have no interaction or no sort of power in the situation. Like I'm just sitting here and somebody's yelling at me. But that's not true. Like active listening, good listening is a really active, interactive communication process. So active, reflective listening, it's about working hard to understand someone's perspective, and it loops back to and connects to what I had talked about in an earlier video when I was talking about emotions and empathy. Okay, so the readings this week have a lot of suggestions about how to engage in active listening. Part of this is really just a mental process of being really intentional to pay attention to what someone is saying and deciding to try to listen from a place where you're understanding the person's perspective on their own terms. So you're not like listening to try to refute their argument or listening to cherry pick ideas that you're going to then disagree with in some way to sort of change them, right? You're listening to try to understand. This is a decision. And it's one of these things that I find I need to remind myself about on a pretty regular basis. When I'm listening well, I'm really trying to learn rather than assuming that I already know what the other person's perspective is. So this mental process, this sort of thought process, this sort of preparation and like remind myself, stay engaged, stay focused, stay in learning mode, that's a really important starting point for this listening. But that's just the beginning, because active listening is very interactive. So when we are listening, we have to show that we're listening, that we're paying attention. It helps the other person feel validated, and it makes it easier for them to keep talking. So as described in the reading this week, this of course means you have to engage non-verbally, right? Doing whatever it is that is appropriate for the situation to show that you're paying attention and listening. You should ask questions that help the other person articulate their concerns and interests and reflect back what you hear to show that you're understanding. So this listening process, it's like preparing and engaging and responding. So let's also think about asking questions, because that's a related communication skill. So asking generative, reflective questions can also really help you uncover someone's interests and concerns during a conflict. This can be tricky because just phrasing something as a question doesn't work, right? Like not all questions are going to do this. For example, questions like, how can you possibly think that? Or why don't you see it my way? Or don't you think what's really going on is, insert my perspective here. Those are not the kind of questions that I'm talking about, because those are not going to help. That's not really coming from a place of understanding. That's coming from a place of defensiveness and being rooted in my own views. So what you those are just going to escalate the conflict and probably, make the other person pretty angry, feel like they're not being listened to. So in contrast, good questions tend to be more open-ended, more rather than kind of saying yes or no answers. They tend to invite more conversation, and there can be a couple of different types. One of the readings this week talks about what they call high gain questions. These are like kind of bigger questions that get the person started. You might ask something near the beginning, and it really invites the other person's story. So how did this all begin? What's the most important thing from your perspective? What's the most important thing in this situation? Big questions like that. Those are open-ended questions that they're high gain in the sense that you can get a lot of information from them there. There's also clarifying questions. Things like, oh, so when you say blank, what does that mean to you? Or what happened after that, right? So questions that just clarify some of the things that the person is saying. And then there can also be like hypothetical or reflective questions that help move the person beyond the current situation to take a bigger picture view. Like in an ideal world, what would X, Y, and Z happen? So of course you don't want to just barrage them with questions that you don't have any response to. This isn't like a quiz, right? It's important to engage and show that you're working to understand. So a good way to do that is to paraphrase or reflect back what you hear them saying. So it sounds like you're frustrated because yada yada. Is that right? So this kind of active listening, asking questions and reflecting back, this is something that I do all the time. I do it in my parenting, I do it in my work, I do it in my sort of community engagement, and it's the kind of thing you got to practice. In a negotiation process, you would engage in this, and then you would have a chance to explain your perspective to the other person, and they would actively listen to you. That doesn't automatically happen. You have to work to set up that expectation and agree about the process with the other person involved. But before you can do any of that, it requires practice. So it's important that you practice active listening and hone your active reflective listening skills in a comfortable learning space so that it just becomes part of what you do. Then later, when you're faced with a conflict situation and emotions are hot, it feels higher stakes, you're already used to listening in this way, and you can use this set of skills. Just like any sort of skill, you got to practice it. So in some workshops or classes I teach, I do an activity to help folks practice this kind of listening. So at the very beginning of class or before the workshop, I'll give them a survey to fill out with a bunch of opinion questions. And they range from, kind of trivial things like cats are better than dogs, or basketball is the best sport, to more complex political questions like there should be stricter laws about abortion, or healthcare should be free to everyone. So every question on this list has a 1 to 5 scale to show how much you sort of agree with, strongly disagree to strongly agree with the statement. So they do this, and then they turn it back into me, and I just we don't actively engage with it for a while. We learn about active listening, and we talk about active listening and paraphrasing, just like I've been doing here. And then I put people in pairs, and I tell them to discuss the item that I have chosen for them from their opinion survey. They get their opinion surveys back with one of the questions highlighted, and it doesn't take them long to figure out that I've basically partnered them up with somebody who they disagree with, someone who marked something really opposite of them on that one item that I want them to discuss. So the task I give is for them to practice good listening, and they take turns. The first person, we're going to say, I'm just going to choose a name and say this is Bob. So Bob takes 1 to 2 minutes to explain why he marked what he did on the opinion question, and I'm, as a listener, just ask clarifying questions if Bob and I are partners. Then when Bob's done explaining his perspective, I try to paraphrase back what I heard. So I'm basically tasked with demonstrating that I've listened and understood the perspective of someone I disagree with. Then the partner roles switch, and the listener, Bob, gets, or then I would share my perspective and Bob would take on the listening role. And he would listen and try to paraphrase as I explain I marked what I did. So a remarkable thing happens when we do this activity. People start out really uncomfortable. Like, it's obviously a really uncomfortable thing to do. Be like, oh yeah, so you put that, I put this other thing, haha, and feeling kind of like anxious and stuff, right? But eventually they kind of settle in, and a lot of folks find it to be pretty meaningful. I often have people say that they found out they have more in common than they expected. Sometimes people say that they interpreted the statement on the questionnaire differently from their partner. So one marked strongly agree and the other marked strongly disagree, but they actually, their reasons for what they marked are pretty similar with each other. So that's always interesting to me. A lot of times people have a personal story, and once I hear, as a listener, I hear like Bob's personal story, I'm like, oh man, I can see how you would get to what you put there, right? So even if people don't change their mind about their own perspective, you start to understand the person who disagrees with them, and you can start to see like, okay, this person is like a reasonable human and not some sort of evil monster or something like this, right? Some people really get into it and even want to move on to talk about a second topic so they can compare their survey answers with their partner, find another thing they disagree with, and then they go on about the activity again. More fundamentally, though, people who do this activity talk about how it feels to be really listened to, and how different that is from their normal conflict experience or just their normal communication experience at all. And folks talk about how challenging but rewarding it is to listen deeply to somebody else. So we can't really do this activity in this class, just given the design of the online course. But I encourage you to find ways to practice this kind of listening in your own life so that you can get comfortable with it. Once you have that base comfort level, then you'll be able to use that in a conflict. It'll be easier to use because you will have this base level of comfort. Active listening, asking good questions, reflecting back what you hear from a place of empathy can be the core of collaborative, integrative conflict management. So that's it for now. I encourage you to practice this listening and think about how it feels for you and how you might use it in conflict situations. I look forward to reading your reflections this week, and as always, let me know what questions you have.